Gilgamesh is very old. Very, very old. Let me see here. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is based on a real person. There was a King Gilgamesh that historians have identified just by his name being included in a list somewhere. If Gilgamesh existed, he probably ranged sometime around 2700 BCE, before the Common Era. So, a while ago. And he did so in ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. You can see Uruk is his city here, but Babylon is here. Babylon, by the way, is Babel, Tower of Babel. That's a whole other thing with the Israelites. But Persian Gulf, it's all fairly familiar territory. It's one of the great civilizations of the ancient era. My favorite, I'll get to that. The earliest related poems, he had a lot of stuff written about him, and we have little fragments of it here and there. The earliest related poems about him appear around 900 or 1900 BCE, so roughly 1,000 years after he died, poems start appearing of him. He's very likely he was a figure that he was a king among many, but then over the years after he died, people started reaching back and saying, that guy, we'll start telling stories about him. He's dead, he has nothing to object to, so, he's as good as anyone. And it's a fun name. Gilgamesh. Yeah, it's fun. The definitive epic appears around 1200 BCE, this one. About 200 years before the first parts of the Hebrew Bible come into being. About 500 years before Homer, whom we'll get to soon enough. They are probably initially oral storytelling, and they get written down in cuneiform tablets. That's where you have the clay and the little shapes that you press into them, and it hardens, and you have, a very heavy something to read. But soon enough, all those cuneiform tablets essentially vanished. They were used, we know, for education for a little while in Babylon and the cities to, inculcate certain values and to basically teach people to read. But they just, they fell out of fashion or something. They just gone, buried in the sands of time. What are you going to do? Sometime in the 1800s, however, chunks of it started turning up. The British, particularly, were on a global mission to restore much of the ancient culture of the Mediterranean and Near East. Restore is the polite term. They were going around the world as archaeologists, digging stuff up and just stealing it. That's kind of what it is. And that's a whole controversy that rages to this day. But the point is, they were doing it, and not too many other people were. So give them credit for that. They bring all this stuff back, they put it in the British Museum, and then they, just look at it and say, all right, what the hell is this stuff? We don't know. And my favorite story about this is they had these tablets laid out in the British Museum, which is a great place. I highly encourage everyone to go. It's just, it's free. You walk in. It can be a line, but not too bad if you go on, off-season stuff. And you just wander around. You see all this old stuff. It's like wandering through your grandparents' attic if your grandparents were, 5,000 years old and they had all this stuff. But they had this tablet laid out, and nobody knew what the hell it said. The language had long since died out, and, cuneiform, all these little shapes, what do they mean? Well, people started staring at them and figuring them out. In particular, there was a guy named George Smith. Great name because it's so bland, so utterly forgettable. He's actually a fairly interesting guy in his own right, but leave that aside. But George Smith worked at the British Museum, and he knew a lot of languages. He was an expert in many different kinds of languages. So they said, you, George, come on over here, sit down, stare at this for, a decade or so, and then what do you think? So he did. He came in and he stared at it. That shape kind of looks familiar. Then you go and you find other variants of languages from all over the world, from all over the history of the world, and you start comparing and contrasting and say, well, if this kind of looks like this and this kind of looks like that, when you put them together, they kind of sound like this. Over time, meaning starts to accumulate. You start to translate. You're teaching yourself a language that has been dead for thousands of years, which is pretty cool. But very labor intensive and probably not something that is, immediate gratification stuff. But George Smith is doing this work. And he's going along and he's piecing it together, little bit. So slow, year after year after year, in this basement of the British Museum, which I gotta figure in the 1800s, not a lot of light, even ugly fluorescent light was, not a thing yet. So, he's leading a fairly dark and, let's face it, depressing existence. But little by little, piecing this together, making sense out of it, until one word: flood. He stumbled across the word flood. And immediately he saw the outlines of a story that paralleled the biblical story of Noah. History had never seen that before. Suddenly he saw documentary evidence of another flood narrative, almost as if you have a corroborating account of it. That's how he saw it, and how many people saw it at the time. It's not just, okay, the Bible says that there's a story of Noah and the flood and whatever, but, that's just the Bible. If it was really a global phenomenon of, destruction and death, it would be, we would have more than one record of it, people. Come on. And here, George Smith found it. The best part of this, George Smith, sitting there in this dank surrounding, depressing year after year after year after year, reading, is so thrilled to find that word. He leaps up in the middle of this empty basement that's cluttered with other stuff, empty of people, cluttered with junk. He starts stripping naked and running around in excitement, screaming, yeah! Which I just love. I imagine this, and he wasn't necessarily this prim Victorian gentleman, but I prefer to imagine him as being this fairly prim Victorian gentleman with very uncomfortable clothing, sort of buttoned up and cinched. That wasn't really him, but you don't picture that guy suddenly stripping naked in the middle of the office. At least not until the holiday party. But anyway, he does. And he eventually pieces together the rest of the story. And more of the story is discovered and assembled from different traditions and different languages. And slowly this legend of this ancient king comes together. It is still highly fragmentary. It is still hotly debated as to what order the stuff goes in, what the correct translation of certain things are. It's still a great, great mystery what the hell this actually is. But we have enough of it to make it really fun. And that's all you need to start. So when we read it, we might be reading stuff that's, it's all assembled after the fact and it's a rough idea of what they think the original might be. But it almost doesn't matter because let's face it, we're not getting the truth of King Gilgamesh here. The people who wrote this were writing it 1,000 years after the guy was worm food. So who really cares? We're not reading it for the history. We're reading it for the story of a hero. But in that, I say, we get an awful lot. We get an awful lot of, well, it's a great literal story. There's a lot of scenes in here, a lot of things happen, a lot of characters that are fun. It is also highly symbolic. And there you can really go nuts because symbolism is always a free-for-all. You can interpret things however you want. But it is also, I say, historic and social. Because it does tell us a little something about the culture at the time. And not so much the culture at the time of King Gilgamesh. Maybe some of that's true. But you can see in the way the story is told, in the emphasis that is put on certain elements, in the patterns that you see emerging, you can see certain elements of history creeping in there and why the story is told a certain way and what messages it is conveying. That's where you get a lot of fun. Anyway, what do you think of the story?
I liked it a lot. Throughout it, when I first read the introduction, I took in some of the elements that it was saying that, what does it mean to be human? So I just kind of kept that in the back of my mind while reading it. So it listed death, friendship, nature, civilization, power. So, but I kept an open mind while reading it. And I found it really interesting that Gilgamesh, who's 2/3 God and 1/3 human.
I don't get the math at all. We see this repeatedly in the ancient world. Parentage, you would think it's like a 1-in-1 thing, but apparently no. It's a wild 3-way.
So
we won't go there though.
With the 1/3 human side, that gave him mortality, but he didn't know that just yet. So as a king, he wasn't necessarily doing things too well. People were complaining about the way he was. He was harsh, rough with people. And when they complained to the gods about him, they created somebody by the name of Enkidu, who was supposed to be somebody that actually challenged Gilgamesh. But and Enkidu also had godlike features as well, but I believe he had some elements of a god that was from the land or something like that. So when they created this person, and Gilgamesh was found out about it from a hunter that encountered Enkidu in the forest. And Enkidu was always living with the animals, but I saw that they referred to animals as beasts, so we're already scared of these animals. I guess they didn't know what they were, so they were beasts to them. So he lived with those animals. So he didn't know what people were, what civilization was, what land was. And he was tempted with basically the equivalent of a prostitute, which lines up pretty close to like the Eve story, which that's how I found that alignment. And can do the fall for that.
He's a guy.
Yeah. So after he fought for it, the animals didn't take him in anymore since he already fell for temptation. So when he first met Gilgamesh, they battled with each other, they wrestled, and then at the end of it, I guess they ended up butting up after fighting. And becoming best friends rather than actually one winning versus the other at that moment. But they're complete opposites of each other. Gilgamesh teaches him about just people, and they end up going on a quest, traveling, and throughout the different travels they does, Kindu warns him many times about things not to do, especially if they're going in a travel to the forest, which is what he knows. So warned him about, not that he wanted to kill a forest watcher of a forest. Of course, Gilgamesh did. Warned him about that. And just throughout the story, there's multiple elements where every single time they were successful in something, and Kindu did try to at least stop him, give him the warning. Gilgamesh still proceeded, and the gods were always watching through this whole time. And eventually, Gilgamesh ends up encountering the goddess of love and warfare, which is Ishtar. And Ishtar wants to be with Gilgamesh, but I guess she didn't have best history with lovers. So he brought
We
that
all
up.
know that girl.
He brought that up. Ishtar didn't like that. Ended up telling her family, which are also gods, which in the end she wanted to kill him. They didn't want to do that since he was a king. So eventually there was going to be some type of punishment of some sort since she was adamant about that. And they put a bull head in front of them, and that, a bull always, even currently, is very strong, very powerful. So the fact that they were able to even overcome that, beat them, that's when the gods realized that, both of them were too strong, so they need to do something about it, and they ended up putting a spell or some sort on Enkidu instead of Gilgamesh, who happened to be a king. So Enkidu ended up dying, and that's when Gilgamesh realized that there is mortality. That was like a wake-up call for him, that this does exist. There is an end of some sort, and he stood awake for 7 days.
Hold on with it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's, okay. Just want to pause for a
Mm-hmm.
second. Very nice. This story, part of it is because we're finding it in literally tablets, big chunks. And pretty much all ancient literature tends to be episodic. It can be very difficult in many traditions to find like a real through line narrative. That's more of a modern way of reading. A novel tends to have like one story that it follows throughout, and the ancient world was more into like digressions here and there, and it's not always so clear how they connect. So it can be important to just slow down sometimes. Let's look at this very simply from the beginning here. In the beginning, this is Horik. What is the problem, excuse me, at the beginning of this poem? What's the problem? A story tends to be the working out of a problem. What is the problem first identified in this story? Anyone?
Wasn't there a wall built around the city too?
Yeah.
To block them out from.
Well, we'll get to the wall. The city itself has a problem. What is it?
Isaac he was like very harsh with like his people.
Yeah.
He had like sex with any woman that like he wanted to, like no matter who it would be.
Gilgamesh is the king. He was practicing what would become what would come to be known as primogeniture, not primogeniture, prima noctis, which is the king's right to have sex with any girl on her wedding night before the groom. You can imagine how well this went over with the commoners, but you know, it's the king. It's good to be the king. Yeah. You get the sense this was a practice from the ancient world, and honestly, it continued into the medieval world, and throughout literature and history, you can come up with lots of examples of leaders who make a point of not doing that, of saying, I have the right, because, you know, I'm the king, but I'm not going to do it because I'm a good king, because it makes, it makes things awkward. So it is generally a sign of a good king that while maintaining the right to do that, he doesn't really go through it. He, however, Gilgamesh, is going through with it. He is, let's use the word, raping these women, girls, because they're probably, pre-adolescent at this age. Raping them, which takes a lot of the fun out of it, let's face it, out of the story. Raping them and then, leaving them to the groom. Hard feelings all around. With the men, that's when he says he leaves no girl to the no bride to the bridegroom, or something like that in the words of the poem. That line is almost always paired with he leaves no son to the mother, or something like that, because while he's doing this at night, during the day, he's going around and starting up fights, starting up wars, and taking people, men, and basically conscripting them into going and fighting for them. He's starting fighting among his people just for his own amusement. I want to watch you fight that guy. Go over and punch him in the face and see what happens. And he's starting wars with outsiders because this is what kings do. But he is doing it constantly and indiscriminately and with no care at all for the consequences. The consequences here being that people are starting to hate him. So, you have and it varies on tradition. Sometimes it is a council of the gods who get together to talk about it and say, we got to do something about this guy. And sometimes it's a council of like city elders, getting together and saying, what are we going to do? What do you do when your leader is a total jackass? Wish I knew. No comment. They have this problem. He is a bull in a china shop, crashing around, causing trouble. So they decide he needs to get cut down a peg or two. Old schoolyard logic. There's a bully, somebody's just got to go and clock him one right in the face. Knock him down once, don't think twice the next time. Schoolyard logic. Works on a grand scale in the epic world too. So they create, or they pray, and again, the levels of authority get a little bit confused sometimes, but basically the gods end up creating Enkidu. You can pronounce the name a number of different ways. Again, I don't care at all about pronunciations. I personally prefer saying Enkidu because it's fun. Enkidu just sort of pops out of the mouth. Enkidu is essentially an animal, a beast. We have been told of Gilgamesh's, 2/3 divinity times pi r squared, I don't know, repeatedly at this point. But now we are presented with Enkidu, who is essentially an animal, but part man as well. So they're both sort of hybrid creatures on different levels. Enkidu is living the good life out with the other animals. You know, going around, come to the watering hole. Hey guys, how's it going? And it's just like, you know, having happy hour with your buddies. Everything's cool. Until what?
So a woman comes.
Oh, ain't that always the way? Guy's hanging out with his buddies and then the woman screws it up. Now, you use the term prostitute. Here, this is a point of some debate. I think this translation uses harlot, which sounds a little prim and proper, harlot. But, while, again, hotly debated, you should bear in mind that in this part of history, we have many cults with practices of these cult sexual priestesses. And it was the job of a priestess, in some respects, to initiate young men into manhood. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but, you know, it's a bar mitzvah with a happy ending. And that was her job. And she is a respected professional. She's not just your common, you know, street hooker. She has a ritual function. She has a religious office. She is a respected professional within the community. Okay, let's go with that. And I would argue, within this, she is one of the more interesting characters. Just on a strict narrative level, you know, she's smart. Her motivations are often a little bit confusing or a little bit mysterious, a little nuanced. And
She clothed him and she took care of him.
yeah, she didn't just go, you know, all right, come here, pal. Wham, bam, thank you, man. You know, she took the time. I mean, quite literally, they say 6 days and 7 nights. You know, you guys are young. You don't know what a Herculean task that could be. It'd kill me. But 6 days, 7 nights, and then, yeah, it's not quite over. She doesn't just take her money off the dresser and leave. He wakes up, understandably a little dehydrated. So, woof. Yeah, go down to the watering hole and refresh. That was, boy. He goes down, sees his buddies hanging out at the watering hole, and hey guys, you won't believe what happened to me this weekend. And they take off. They recognize he's different. He has changed. He's no longer an animal. He's got, you know, girly cooties on him. But think about this. Women are civilizing. Women make men better. Women, you know, you start dating a nice girl and suddenly, all right, I'm going to tuck in my shirt occasionally. You know, I'm not going to laugh at fart jokes so much. I'm going to be a better version of myself. This is the effect. And Shamhat, she has a name. Characters in the ancient world who are granted a name are important. If she was just always the harlot, you would reduce her to that. But if you get a name, you're important. Watch which characters get names. Many characters will just go by, you know, their function in society. If you get a name, you're significant. Shamhat does educate him. It's not just about 6 days, 7 nights, wham bam, thank you, man. They eat together. They have significantly bread and beer, which is interesting. Beer was invented in ancient Mesopotamia, guys. But what would be significant about that? Why bread and beer? A little bloating. Why?
Because it required humans to have settled down to be able to grow.
What's that?
Humans have to settle down like in groups to be able to grow wheat and.
Yeah, it's a product of civilization. Believe it or not, beer is a symbol of civilization. Also tends to undercut it, but what are you going to do? You have to make it. As an animal, Enkidu could just wander around and, nibble some leaves, maybe attack and eat a gazelle if he's not your buddy. And when he's thirsty, he just goes down to the pond and, that's it. But bread and beer have to be prepared. You have to grow through agriculture. You have to grow the ingredients. You have to do a fairly complex process. Anybody who's ever tried to make beer knows this. Even as stupid a thing as it is, you gotta leave it in your closet for like 6 weeks or something. It's a process. And it takes some sophistication. It takes some civilization. It's a sign that you're civilized. Again, it seems incongruous with modern day, but it is. She does this for him. She prepares him. She makes him wear clothing. Again, thinking Adam and Eve, the fig leaf, you're starting to see a symbolic value here where they're putting on clothing. They are putting on a new level of civilization. They're putting on, in some ways, a disguise. Their essential natures are now disguised under the sign of sophistication. I believe it's specified that they are wearing fine clothing, not just, fig leaves at this point, but something that has to be produced, manufactured in a civilized society. These themes are starting to seep in, starting to see conflicts there. Okay, so Enkidu has, the happy ending bar mitzvah, and he comes out of the jungle, or wherever the hell it is, the steppe, the wilderness, depending on the translation. I like wilderness. I think this one uses steppe. I prefer wilderness. It's more symbolic, but we'll get to that. And he goes to work, where immediately, and here I gotta say, whoever wrote this, and it could have been dozens of people over, or hundreds of people even, over centuries, piecing it together little by little. Whoever it was robbed by history by not being able to work in Hollywood. Because this guy has some sense of, the Western. Because you get this sudden thing where these two titanic forces that we've been introduced to are slowly coming into town. And you see this in every Western movie. For those of you who like Westerns, go watch some Westerns. They're really good. Where the good guy and the bad guy come into town and they meet on either end of the one wide street running through. Steely-eyed, firm of jaw, legs spread, hands out, ready to grab that sidearm. And they fight, and it's great. And you see massive destruction all over the place on a scale that you only really get in Hollywood. Everything is level. They're crashing, they're slamming into one another, they're pinning one down and getting up and going back and back and back and back and fight. Who doesn't love a good fight? And they do, and you're rooting for them. You don't even care. You're just saying, oh, this guy's up now, this guy's up now, this guy's up. Great. Until at the end, when they're all but spent, Gilgamesh, as the hero, pins the mere mortal. Doesn't kill him. Of course, and again, at this point, a, baggy Hollywood cliche, now that they have fought to a near draw, I defeated you. But, damn it, I respect you. And they become buddies. It's stupid, it's a cliche, but it can't be a cliche because these guys did it first. And they go off and they go arm in arm, and you can just picture them going off to the local gin mill and say, all right, I'm buying you around. And they have this moment where they're suddenly very, into one another, let's say. And there's some dwelling on the fact that Enkidu has long hair like a woman. And you can read this in many different ways, edging down that path if you want. And it's all fair and good. I personally like the moment when it starts leading down there, where it's like, all right, they're getting a little too friendly after having wrestled for a couple of hours or whatever. And then suddenly, Gilgamesh having, looking around perhaps and seeing everybody watching, and you're kind of hugging an awful lot all of a sudden. His response? Let's go kill something. Total guy stuff. We gotta go kill something. Let's go be guys. There's a monster over there. He is guarding and protecting cedar, wood. Now, I don't know much about anything, really. But I am guessing that in this part of the world, trees are not that common. You don't find that many. It's very dry, even in the ancient world. So cedars, wood, stuff you can build with, well, that's a premium. And it's way before Amazon. You cannot order it. So, this monster, in what is essentially thought to be Lebanon, that's a good hike, is guarding over these trees, guarding over these cedars. And they have to go get them, because that's what guys do. We're going to go slay a monster. Enkidu says, do we really want to do that? That's a little much. Dangerous, Enkidu is from the wilderness. He is tied to that sense of, okay, stuff dies in the wilderness. I don't want to do that. I don't want to die. Gilgamesh said, what a glorious end to die in battle. What could be better than that? How wonderful. People will be singing our praises and celebrating our names for generations and generations, and in fact, eternity. Because everybody knows Uruk is going to last forever, and it is still the penultimate or the greatest civilization in the history of the world, and is still just the capital of everything. Everybody knows that, right? So they do, and they go, and it's another titanic battle, and they kill the monster. And they come back and they display the head, and presumably steal a whole buttload of wood, because you can build stuff with wood. another female. Ishtar.
Yes.
Ishtar sees the heroes come back, says, ooh, getting the warm feelies. That Gilgamesh, he's, she goes to him and says, what?
She wants him to be her husband, basically, to marry.
Yeah. Little power dynamic thing going on there. She is full goddess. He's kind of a god, sort of, but, less so. And, she husband is probably a loose term. I think we can go full boy toy on this. What's his reaction?
He initially the first thing is basically just brought up all of her past and
Yeah. He doesn't handle it tactfully. There's a nice way to turn someone down.
he just asked her, what do I have to give you then? What do you want from me? That was what he kept saying to her. So if I do this, then what do I have to provide you? Because she apparently has killed previous lovers.
Ishtar has some history. There are a few red flags getting up there, When you meet somebody and you're just sitting there having a conversation, you're just slowly, checking out their social media history. It's like, ooh. Red flags. Let's avoid this one. Danger! Stalker. Bad stuff. And Gilgamesh is a little less than tactful. He isn't just, scrolling through. He's not doing that. He's saying, look, here, you're a psycho. You do bad stuff. I've seen the other guys you have, chosen, and they don't come out of this well. And he basically laughs at her. He ridicules her. He embarrasses her. Word to the wise. If you're going to turn someone down, do it tactfully. Unintended consequences. You never know who that person knows. And in this case, she knows her father, who is the big god. Now here again, we're going to get into translation, because when she goes to her father, there's one word that I think really captures it that I don't believe is in this translation. I believe if you look it up, she goes to him, and I'm not going to take the time to find it, but she goes to him and says, Father, this person has insulted me, he's mocked me, he needs to be taught a lesson. That's true, that's a simple, literal reading, and it's like, all right, that's kind of what happened. But there is another translation that I really kind of like, where instead of, Father, this person has insulted me, it's, Daddy, he insulted me. And that one word, Daddy, really captures something I think we can say. What does it do?
She's a brat. She's entitled.
She's a brat. She's entitled. It infantilizes her a little bit. Suddenly, she's not, the goddess Ishtar appealing through the layers of authority to her father, the king of the gods. She's just, Paris Hilton whining. Daddy, he was mean to me. Make him suffer. Another negative portrayal of women. She overreacts. Granted, Gilgamesh did not handle this well. She overreacts. She gets emotional and hysterical, and bad things happen because of that. So then, they send down the bull of heaven. He tramps around, kind of like the way Gilgamesh himself was a bull, just sort of trampling around his city, destroying everything. But they kill that too. And consequences from that lead to
this death of unfortunately. Even though he wasn't the one that.
Yeah, and again, different translations and different editions are going to be a little bit vague on this, but Enkidu gets sick, and he lies in bed for quite some time. I think another 6 days, 7 nights in his sick bed. The parallelism with the earlier is obvious. And he says at one point, why couldn't I have died fighting Humbaba? Or Huwawa, I'm not sure which. Again, the names change from one version to the other. Why couldn't I have died in battle then? I would be a hero. Now I'm just withering away. I'm suffering, and I can feel my life draining out of me. And it takes a long time, and it's humbling, and it's sad. There's nothing heroic about that. When he dies, Gilgamesh falls apart. Gilgamesh just loses it. He sits and he stares at the body for days and days and days. And 7 days. Parallels. He can't understand. He's waiting for something. And he commands for elaborate funerals to be held, these grand social spectacles to honor the fallen Enkidu. But even that doesn't really satisfy him. Think about the seeming completeness that comes from a good funeral in the Egyptian tradition that we've read about, but now that all seems exterior, superfluous almost. And Gilgamesh just falls apart. He stops bathing. Guys. He stops wearing clothing. Shedding civilization. There's ritualistic washing at key points throughout the story, which is a sign of growing civilization. Watch how Enkidu gets bathed ritually with Shamhat. There is dressing ritually about putting on clothing, entering civilization. He puts all that aside. He goes wandering the wilderness. Again, I think here they're talking about a steppe, which is a little too, geographic for my taste as a translation. It's probably quite literal, but essentially he goes wandering out into nothing. I prefer wilderness. And the symbolic value of that. You can see somebody just wandering around a wasteland with nothing out there, searching for something. He is now reduced. He's no longer, in a way, the hero. And he's, at this point, dropped below human status even, because he's essentially living like an animal. Where does he go?
He goes to, he ends up encountering the sea, which represents like a death of water, which he can't touch because if he touches it, then he can die. But he encounters someone that there was a person, a human that actually supposedly reached immortality and was able to walk along this water. Over.
Who is this? Utanapishtim. Another fun name to say. It's an ancestor of Gilgamesh, supposedly. And here we have the flood story.
Yes.
The parallel with Noah. And Gilgamesh hears that you can get some answers to what you want if you just go talk to him. Gilgamesh has been freaking out. Gilgamesh, it's not just the loss of his friend, but soon after Enkidu dies, he's very clearly, and I think very humanly, said, wait a minute, that could happen to me. So the guy who didn't care about death at all, like, oh, nothing, what is that? A hero's death would be great. Now he cares passionately. Suddenly he sees his own mortality, and he is doing anything to escape it, to find an out. And he gets told, go speak to Utinapishtim. He is the only person who has achieved immortality. And, coincidences being what they are, he is your ancestor. He'll welcome you with open arms. And he goes to the underworld. He goes to the afterlife. He goes to, in a sense, heaven. It's not heaven really, but it's the afterlife. And he meets him. And it's a lovely little interaction with Utinapishtim and Utinapishtim's wife, never named, but a significant character in her own right for the way they interact. You can make an awful lot of that. They give him a plant and say, this will convey eternal life. Almost like, I'm crazy for thinking this, but almost like the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So they say, take this. And Gilgamesh does. And he goes and he's been hunting for this thing for how long now? It's this heroic quest, and he finally has what he is. So, of course, what he does is take a nap. As one would. Again, he's a guy. But here you can see a little bit, there's a little symbolism happening here where to sleep is to die, in a way.
And he also was weary of it, so he wanted to take it back with him to have someone else test it before he ate it.
Yeah, he's got a few plans going on. It could be poison. Utinapishtim could just be a big jerk. But what happens with the plant?
It gets stolen from him by a serpent.
Oh, serpent! Well, we've certainly never seen one of those before. Who comes, steals that,
That's it.
and immediately sheds its skin, which gives you a nice little etiological explanation as to why the snakes shed their skin. It is a sign of eternal youth. He lives forever as a snake because they just keep shedding old skin. Etiology. It's a fun word to say. But you can see the disappointment. You can see crestfallen. The irony of the one thing he wanted, he loses in the end. But what does he do after that?
So he realizes that this whole travel, he pretty much is walking away with nothing. He feels like in that moment. So he heads back to his hometown and actually admires on his trail back, admires everything that was built during that time frame and realizes that it's not that he doesn't have nothing. He actually did a lot through his time frame and appreciates that in the end versus just looking for eternal life. There is something to always remember him. So he lives through the things and history that's going to continue to live through. His name.
History. He comes back, and you have this speech, a speech that essentially begins the whole poem. Look up at the walls, and you see, 3 square miles of gardens, 3 square miles of something else, and he's basically a city planner right now, laying things out very logically, and bragging about his city. His city as a great civilization. His city as what he himself, as king, essentially built. I'm not saying he slapped down the bricks or anything, but it is under his kingship that this great civilization rose. Think about the contrast. when he was younger and kind of the jackass. He was behaving as a hero. He was going and doing whatever he wanted, violating human norms indiscriminately, and he could get away with it. When asked about death, he scoffed at it. Said, "Oh, to die a hero would be great. What better way to go? Because people will remember you for thousands of years." But he had to settle for being human and all of the pain that involves and all the disappointment that involves and all the loss inherent in that. We are all Gilgamesh in that moment because we all confront our own mortality, our own limitations. We are not, no matter how much we want to be, heroes. But Gilgamesh wanted to be a hero so that he could live on in memory, so that people would sing songs about him and celebrate his name. And now, he's achieved that. It's a different kind of heroism. It's a different kind of immortality. Think about fame for a minute. Fame is immortality. You tell stories of people who are famous long after they are gone. And think about how fame happens. Fame demands other people's participation. You can't be famous without other people buying in. Other people need to gather together to tell those stories of you. Otherwise, you're not famous. Fame is immortality through social means. And that's what he can achieve. So think about this. In an historic sense. The story is telling people, leaders and presumably some ordinary folks alike, that kind of like how in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life was just sort of shunted aside, saying, "No, that's not for you." What is for you is concerned with the earth, with stuff going on here. Focus on building a civilization. Focus on what you can achieve here. Don't make yourself crazy trying to be a hero. Aspire to the virtues of heroism when you can. But you cannot escape the limitations of being human. What you can do is build. What you can do is work together and build a civilization, a city. Come together to do that. You celebrate the heroes along the way. You use that to unify, to give a shared sense of identity and purpose. But you always focus on building for the future. It's very convenient for authority figures to say, because they want people who will go home at night and tell stories of great adventures with great fights and magical creatures and monsters and gods and all of this stuff, but they want them to show up to work the next day. Because a kingdom without workers falls away. That's what this story on multiple levels is doing. It's appealing to the human in all of us and giving us wildly profound symbols to grapple with, to find meaning in our own lives. But at the same time, it's doing a little social engineering there. And it's making sure that everybody knows heroes are great. You're not one of them. Punch the clock, show up, grab a shovel, get to work.